Hey guys, it's Mr. Webker here. I might be a little louder than normal. My Wi-Fi went out at home, so I have to record this video at Starbucks. So my apologies. But thank you so much for following along. If you have any questions, like always, you can email me. This is our week 3 of World War II, and we're going to go over the end of World War II and what came out of it leading into the Cold War. So in this third week, we get to discuss the end of the war and how it ended, some extreme things that were used during the war, like the atomic bomb, and sort of what comes out of this, the issues that America and Russia have, and what will lead up to be the Cold War. So just before the war ended, the three major allies got together to develop a plan with what to do with Europe after World War II. Um, they they wanted to develop these nations and then give them back to the people so they could run their own country. Unlike World War One, where they made people pay for the devastation they created, they were not going to make Germany pay for it, but they were going to take over parts of Germany, rebuild it, make it a strong country, and then give them their country back. That's at least what they agreed to, but Stalin didn't really like that idea. Stalin only got into the war in the first place because he wanted to take more land, and so he felt that if he had taken over this land, he should be able to keep it. This would lead to major issues or fights between the United States and the Soviet Union, which would later create the Cold War. And so this is really the beginnings of the Cold War. As World War II ends, these two countries begin to have disagreements, which will cause the tensions of World War II. So this week specifically, I want to focus on the three major battles that we need to know about during World War II, which was D-Day, the Battle of Midway, and Stalingrad. All three battles were in different parts of the world, but all had major importance um, for the Allies. So this week, those are our three major battles. It will be D-Day, the Battle of Midway, and the Battle of Stalingrad. We started to learn about D-Day on Friday. Remember, we watched that YouTube video about the issues that caused D-Day. Basically, D-Day was the first time that the Allies were able to go back onto mainland Europe. Hitler had taken over all of Europe, and so the Allies needed to find a way to get back on to the European continent. They were only fighting Hitler from the Russian side, so they needed to find a way to go to the other side of Europe and attack Hitler. They realized that in France there was a beach town called Normandy, and that if they could take over Normandy, they'd be able to put troops onto mainland Europe and fight um, the Germans. The problem with that is that this would be a hard thing to do. To get onto mainland Europe, they would have to go onto a beach that was heavily protected by the Germans. So imagine being on a beach with no cover, nowhere to hide, and having German machine guns shoot at you. This ended up uh, being one of the deadliest battles in World War II. 2,700 men died that day, which is about as many as died in all of the Afghanistan war. And the Allies were able to win, even though they lost so many soldiers, and they took over this beach, which would later be the landing point for many more troops as we fought in World War II. On the Russian side of the war, one of the most infamous battles was the Battle of Leningrad. Leningrad is the capital city of Russia at the time. So, in order to take over all of Russia, the Germans would have to invade Leningrad. So, the Germans, the way they fought the war was they basically burned everything in Russia down to the dirt because they thought that if they could burn everything, the Russians would not be able to fight the war against them. They successfully did so in Leningrad. They burnt down all the food around Leningrad and then made sure that no food could go into the city. Basically, their idea was that if they could starve the Russians, then the Russians would give up. They tried to do this, but it did not go well. They did this during winter, and like I've told you a million times before, history always is not on the side of people who invade Russia during the winter. So the Germans tried to outlast the cold winter of Russia, and they did not do so. They were actually successfully pushed back by the Russians, um, and the Russians were able to save Leningrad and make the Germans surrender because it was so cold in Russia that the Germans did not want to continue to try and starve the city. In the Pacific Ocean, the United States had to fight against Japan basically on their own. Not many people had soldiers to send to the Pacific Ocean because they were fighting the war in Europe. So the uh, the the Americans create this new strategy to take over Japan by creating something called the island hopping policy, which basically meant that they would take over small islands on their way up to Japan. They wouldn't actually just jump into Japan and take over Tokyo, but they would actually take over small islands on the way there that Japan had taken over. And so, if they could take these islands back, then they could begin to move their way towards Japan. One of the most important islands for them to take over was in the middle of the ocean, literally the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Until this battle was called the Battle of Midway, because the island was Midway Island. Very fitting. Until the U.S. sees that Japan basically has taken control of the island, until they plan a surprise attack. So at night, the U.S. sneaks. I'm sorry, their battleships up to the island and begins to bomb it. They have airplanes come off their ships and basically destroys the island. This is the first time that the United States wins one of these battles, and it begins the island hopping strategies, um, which will end up winning the Pacific War for the Americans. So in 1945, both Roosevelt and Adolf Hitler um, die in April, literally the same month. It's a weird um, process. Roosevelt dies of sickness, so he's never able to see the end of the war. His vice president will take over, Harry Truman, after him. But Adolf Hitler dies reportedly of suicide. There are some debates on whether or not that actually happened. But the Nazi Germany has basically been taken over by this time. Hitler knew his time was up, and so he sort of disappears, most likely by suicide. And so in May of 1945, basically all of Germany surrenders and the war is over. Um, and this is proclaimed or called Victory in Europe Day, or VE Day. May 8th, 1945 will stand as the day that the war is over in Europe and that all Germans surrender. So after VE Day, the three major allies are supposed to agree to what they said they would do in Yalta during the Yalta conference. Um, but Stalin doesn't agree to that. Stalin, like always, does his own thing. And so he keeps the nations that he took over during World War II in Eastern Europe by Russia, and makes them all communists. The United States wants to stop this spread of communism in Europe. They're afraid that it'll spread everywhere, and so they begin to give money to countries that choose not to be communists. They give them money by aid, by food. They rebuild cities for them, and basically the idea is that if we support you now, you will not fall to communism like the rest of Europe. The United States spent about $13 billion in 17 European countries, which is a lot of money. We'll go over that this week. And these countries, in return, are supposed to be allies of the United States. On the Japanese side of the war, the United States has a few more problems. Um, One of the main problems is that the Japanese, by culture, do not surrender. It is not in their culture to surrender. So if we wanted to win a war against Japan, we would have to take over and destroy just about the whole country. And this scared the president, Harry Truman, at the time, because he felt that this would cost many American lives. And so he said that in order to lower the amount of death, we might need to use nuclear weapons to do so. The United States has been secretly making atomic bombs, which were larger than any bomb we had ever seen before. They did not know how powerful they were, but they thought that if they tried them, they could use that as an example that if you do not stop the war soon, we will continue to use these and destroy Japan. So the United States actually drops 2 atomic bombs on the city of Hiroshima and on the city of Nagasaki, and basically destroy the whole city. Um, this scares the Japanese because they realize the power that the United States has, and they surrender to the United States after this. Like I said, we dropped bombs on both Hiroshima and Nagasaki and instantly killed thousands of people, which means the second the bomb dropped, thousands of people just disappeared, like vaporized. It's insanity. Um, but death did not stop after the bomb was dropped. The radiation and the exposure from it burned even more people and caused death of thousands more. This death would be a painful death. It would literally be like you were being cooked from the inside out. Um, it was probably the most painful way to go, and the devastation that they had continued to affect people for probably about 50 years. People felt the effect of this radiation exposure. The Japanese surrendered on August 15, 1945, just after the bomb dropped. They signed their treaty to General MacArthur. Um, General MacArthur would be in charge of rebuilding Japan. America decided that they were going to rebuild Japan and make them into a democracy so that way, hopefully, we would not have to fight a war against them. This was successful. We are still allies with Japan today. Um, but General MacArthur was in charge at the time after the war in order to ensure that Japan was rebuilt and turned into a democratic nation. And the last thing for today, in order to try and stop the spread of communism after World War II, the United States and Winston Churchill, who was the leader of England at the time, decided to plan a way to get all nations to come together and hopefully encourage peace and stop war. They created in 1945. They created um, a new organization under something called the Atlantic Charter, which they would call the United Nations. What the United Nations or the UN would do is they would be a place to encourage peace, and they would have the power to help out nations if they were defending peace and freedom. It'd be like an army that was built by all the nations in the world in order to hopefully protect democracy and stop war. That was their goal after sort of the craziness that was World War One and Two. How can we create a place where all people can live in harmony and would have the power to back that up? So that's our notes for the week. Remember to highlight the answers to your PowerPoint guide in your Cornell notes and then write the answers onto your PowerPoint guide. I'm sorry if it was a little noisy in the background. My Wi-Fi is down at home, so I had to do this at Starbucks. But thank you so much. If you have any questions, message me on Remind. This will be due Thursday. I appreciate you guys, and I hope you have a great week.